Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest Service Department News webinar. And that video has just reminded me I need to check whether my trousers still fit because the ceremony is looming. It's in a few weeks' time. Hope to see loads of you there. Today, we are going to be looking at the interface between Airbnb and the extended stay service department and apart hotel market. And we have got a fantastic panel of experts to talk about it in a minute. But I want to show you a couple of quick slides first. My name is George Sell. I'm editor-in-chief at International Hospitality Media, the publisher of SAN, and we are a multimedia platform of B2B news, and we also have live events and award schemes, as you saw just earlier. This webinar series is sponsored by Urban Rest, and we are just going to watch a short video to find out some more about them. So thanks to Urban Rest for sponsoring the series. If you'd like to get in contact with those guys or find out more, you can see some contact details in the chat. On the subject of which, we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions for our panelists as the conversation goes on, please do submit them using either the Q&A or the chat function in Zoom. We'll either answer them there and then if it's on the topic we're discussing, or we'll save a few minutes at the end of the session to get around to them. Everyone who has registered for today's webinar will receive a link to a recording of the session in the next few days. So we have got a great panel, as I said earlier, to talk about the topic, and I'm going to ask the guys to introduce themselves from left to right as we see them on the screen. So first of all, Steve, welcome to you.
Hello. My name's Steve Lowy. I'm the CEO of the Residence and AES. Residence is a corporate long stay service apartment provider in London, and AES is a student housing provider and academic services provider, mainly to American students, also in London. And I'm also chair of ASAP, which is the Association of Service Apartment Providers.
So 3 hats on one session. There's going to be quite a lot of stuff coming your way today, Steve.
Okay.
Secondly, Kevin, good morning to you.
Yes, hi, my name is Kevin. I'm an expansion manager for Stayry. We are currently operating in the DACH region. Our portfolio is 14 apartments with roughly 1,300 rooms, and we are a service apartment provider.
Thanks, Kevin. And last but not least, Paul, good morning to you.
Hi, I'm Paul Stevens. I'm editor of shorttermrentals.com at International Hospitality Media, so familiar face to George. We're a B2B website covering all of the latest news, opinion and intelligence from across the global short-term vacation rental space. I'm also host of the annual Shorties Awards for the sector, which took place last week. So looking forward to the session today.
Thanks, Paul. You will be able to see the LinkedIn profiles of all our panelists in the chat. So if you'd like to carry on the conversation with them after this session, please do so. And there's going to be quite a lot of information in the chat, actually. So when the webinar finishes at 12, we'll leave it open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes from what's in there. So just to give the discussion a bit of context, these are some screen grabs from Service Department News and Short-Term Rentals, two of the websites that we publish. Just to give you an idea of some of the topics we're going to discuss today. Legislation is obviously a hot topic. There's quite a lot of legislation coming in aimed at the short stay sort of Airbnb market, but that's also inevitably affecting extended stay and service department providers. And we're also seeing over the years, some of these stories are from a few years ago, but a couple of them show the evolution of what Airbnb has been trying to do to broaden its offer, acquiring a business travel specialist in Urbandor a few years ago, and then putting a much bigger focus on longer stays and extended stays, more of which we will find out shortly. So to kick the conversation off, Paul, I want to come to you. Obviously, on short-term rentals, you write an awful lot of stories about Airbnb. You know, as the biggest player in the space, you keep a close eye on what they're doing. So can we kick off by trying to find out from you how the average length of stay on Airbnb is changing, and what its strategy for extended stays is? Because as we saw from the slide there, the company is trying to move into the extended stay market in a bigger way.
Yeah, I think you mentioned there, I think we've seen a lot of shifts, and probably a lot of that has been seen and accelerated since the pandemic. It's interesting actually that the CEO, Brian Chesky, has quoted the long-term stay segment, and by long-term stays, I would say 28 days or longer. Perhaps some of the panel or other people would disagree on kind of that terminology or length of stay. But Chesky said that was the largest growing segment across Airbnb's business, and we've seen that length of stay continue to grow over the past couple of years. Potentially that's starting to moderate a little bit more, but definitely that acceleration of length of stay we've seen caused by maybe a rise in flexible and remote working pattern changes, and also you mentioned there the threat of incoming regulations that I know we're going to be discussing. Forgive me if I throw a couple of statistics at you as well, but just things that we've covered recently on short-term rentals. In the most recent earnings reporting for Q4 2023 that was released in February, Airbnb quoted that trips with a duration of 3 months or longer increased by almost 20% on the equivalent quarter in 2022. And according to Airbnb as well, the number of long-term stays has increased by more than 30% since 2019. So perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised by those figures. I think if you look back maybe to the pre and start of COVID, and I was gathering some statistics that the average length of stay pre-COVID was around 3 to 4 nights. In the US, moving forward into the pandemic, that rose very steeply to around 9 nights. In the UK and Europe, that rose to about 11 to 12 nights. In the UK alone, I think it was about a 154% rise in length of stay between January and May of that year too. So definitely seeing more of a shift towards long-term stays. I guess the question is how big is that part of the strategy, and certainly we can delve into that a bit more moving forward in the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We'll move on later to talk about Airbnb's specific plans to target business travel. But Steve, if I can start with you for a minute, hearing what Paul said about the growth in the 3 months and more stays on Airbnb, what do you think are the immediate implications of this for traditional operators in the extended stay sector, should we say? So the operators, the agents, the relo companies, the people who've traditionally handled this kind of business.
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting, and I think we look back a bit, and Paul, you know, young by years, but old by knowledge, is obviously Airbnb are not the only game in town that do short letting. You know, all the big OTAs caught on to the fact that Airbnb was found a niche that was a really popular form of accommodation for people to use for short stays. And I remember 10 years ago, a lot of business travel agents getting really nervous that Booking.com were doing their own business travel portal. But that hasn't stopped business travel agents still doing really well. So I think it's a similar thing. I think what is challenging with, and we've got 80 odd apartments under the corporate brand, is that with corporate relocation, doing live bookings on long stays is quite difficult. There's a lot of toing and froing, there's pets, there's pianos, there's different requests that just from a cold booking perspective can be a little challenging from a live availability point of view. But also there's operators with far greater stock, with maybe 500 or 600 units, where actually this is potentially a really good route to be able to give live availability and rates and do it. I mean, obviously a lot of corporate relo is personal emails and requests and platforms and everything else, where rates are not public, really. Sorry, so I think it would give greater visibility. I think also, in my role as ASAP, we've just launched a study about the volume and value of service apartments in the UK. And obviously the service apartment industry and short let industry has been quite happy under the radar for years. But with all the, all the restrictions coming in place, whether it's New York or Dublin or Barcelona, the industry's had to sort of fight back, and the only way you can fight back is with data. And you can see that, there are a lot of operators who are very compliant. There's some who aren't, with the London situation and around the 90-day stay. And so I think it would be a really interesting tool to monitor how these restrictions are going to swing how things work. In New York, the minimum 30-day rule will immediately, if Airbnb still want to operate, make the length of stay longer, because in theory you shouldn't be able to get that shorter stay online. But I think it changes the dynamics of your team. Maybe if you're a smaller corporate operator that dealt with like 5 or 6 reload companies, everything's on request, that actually you'll need to change the skills to be working with a more online platform. Obviously with Airbnb, you can have your account set up for request or for live availability. And Paul will know better than me, but I'm sure the conversion is 90% better if it's live availability than if it's request. But it will change the dynamics a bit. How that then interlinks, which I'm sure we'll cover regulation, with regulation going forward, is another matter. And I think at the moment there's just so many things going on just in the UK, but also globally, that I think no one really knows. Our length of stay, we is all sort of 60. Every apartment's like 60 or 80 night average length of stay. We get a lot of extensions, but for us, it's really nice to have different channels, if possible, to give a new market. It's people. There's Plum Guide as an example we work with, and that's more luxury extended stay, and that's great for us. We don't get thousands of bookings, but it works really well for us. So yeah, I think we'll change the dynamics. Sorry if that was a bit waffly, but yeah, it's sort of a very broad question.
Thanks, Steve. But we'll come back to talk in more detail about legislation shortly. But Kevin, if I could come to you now, as an operator, are you seeing Airbnb aiming for your key markets, or do you still see yourselves functioning well alongside them?
I think now, for now, I used to lead the revenue management department for Stayry, so I know Airbnb quite hard and how they actually work. For us, actually, we get along with them very well. Like we use the platform. All of our apartments are on Airbnb, and so far it's working very well. I mean, now those numbers that they want to extend the length of stay. Obviously, it has governmental restrictions. For example, here in Germany, we have them already. So the maximum length of stay is 182 days. Then obviously the guest has to check out and then check in again. And also Airbnb is pushing in a way of forward that they also decrease the commission by, I think now for long stays, which is over 28 days in Germany, you pay like 6% commission. Because they saw the increase that Booking is also pushing for the extended stay sector, and now Airbnb is doing it. For us, it works quite well also because it's more leisure-driven guests. And what they like about us being on Airbnb, they actually know it's a professional host. The standard when they book us is always the same. And for us, in the end, we are more happy of an Airbnb guest because we had a huge problem in Germany that people, especially from Germany, they don't know serviced apartments. I mean, for the UK, you guys know it. If you ask elderly people, they know serviced apartments. Here in Germany, you have to. We are currently now more of, hey, we have to introduce the whole concept of a digital check-in to the guest. And if someone books through Airbnb, obviously they know how it works, like because they're used to receiving a PIN code, checking in digitally. There's no reception. So obviously this whole guest education for us is not there, which is usually quite operating heavy. And if you think about it, that you have limited resources in the way of stuffing on property, it can be very rough. I mean, we are quite happy with Airbnb, and for us, it's also working very, very well. And we use indeed the live occupancy, so they have everything. You just book it. You as a guest, and you get all the check-in informations, and you're done. And the good thing in the end is you, as an operating company, you receive the money from Airbnb. Does not matter what happens, which is also some sort of a benefit of using Airbnb. If you would ask me, is the platform ready to really go into the extended stay market and like push against proper operators which have a big number? No.
Interesting. I remember early in the days of Airbnb, operators in the UK at least were listing on Airbnb to fill short stay gaps between longer business, maybe weekends and this kind of thing. And they were doing it because the commission rates were quite a bit lower than the other OTAs. But then I think Airbnb commission rates went up, so they were broadly similar. Kevin, with your revenue management experience, how do they compare in terms of overall cost compared with other OTAs and other channels?
They actually now, I mean, before if they also had 15% commission up to 18 in Berlin, so it's rather similar to Booking. And for us, it was more of getting the market reach out there, like be presentable. Because if people, at least, and I can only speak for the DACH market, if people search for serviced apartments, the first thing which comes in mind, even if you have a strong brand, is Airbnb. At least that's also what I noticed since I work in the hospitality industry. They don't call you serviced apartment. There's more or less like, oh, so you guys are doing something similar than Airbnb, which means then the first thing they do is, in order to reach you, or they type in Airbnb Stayry. And then that's what we figured out. It was like, oh, it's actually I mean, everyone has to decide if they want to use the platform or not, but I can just highly recommend just be listed, be live listed, just give them 2 or 3 rooms or 4 or 5, because they push you guys. And if you have a nice listing, good reviews, you have the host recommendation like Superhost. It's a very good marketing effort, and you pay nothing for it.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Kevin. Paul, let's move back to legislation for a while. Can you kind of give us a summary of the type of legislation that's being introduced in major cities? Obviously, there are regional differences, but can you just give us a kind of overview to start with?
Yeah, I mean, I'll touch on New York shortly because that's a particularly pertinent example. But if we're focusing here on the UK and EU at the moment, we've got an EU legislative framework, more of a sort of standardised regulation, which is about to come into effect across the bloc of 27 countries. And very much the thought of the EU here is to promote a balanced tourism ecosystem, in their words. And for the short-term rental or Airbnb industry, there's definitely the sense that the industry and the segment are being scapegoated for wider issues, maybe around low house building rates or shortage of affordable housing supply, hike in housing prices too in some regions. But this is perhaps a step towards more fair and proportionate rules. They've been talking for some time. I mean, I think we first covered this in stories back in 2020 or 2021. There's still some way to go with it, because they're looking at the sort of standardizing the collection and sharing of data. And realistically, the actual new legislation, when it comes into effect, is probably still about 2 years away, just down to the legislation, how long it takes to transition it in that way. But I mean, in the UK, and I'm thinking of England and Scotland in particular, we're starting to see licensing schemes come into effect too. That's obviously a big concern for the sector, along with scrapping of tax relief. And it does perhaps seem slightly rushed and excessive if we're talking about levelling the playing field in terms of accommodation. And then I go back to New York as well, if we're talking quite broadly, really. This, I think, in the new letting laws came into effect in September, by which time I think I'm right in saying there are about 40,000 Airbnb listings. That's gone down quite significantly now, and basically it involves short-term rental hosts, again registering with city governments, hosts proving that they live in the dwelling and that they meet all of the safety and regulatory requirements. I think this is probably going to be more along the lines of what we see in terms of regulation legislation moving forward, as advocacy groups and organisations work closely with local governments. But at the same time, in New York, we're starting to see these subletting networks cater more to the mid and long-term rental segment as a kind of way to bypass the new laws. So there's definitely, I think, further legislation is inevitable. It does seem to be the type of stories that we cover most regularly on short-term rentals all over the world. And if you're talking globally, it's quite hard to kind of narrow it down, but it's certainly something we're watching with interest.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Paul. Steve, with your ASAP hat on, can you tell us a bit about the proposed legislation in the UK and how that is going to affect the traditional service department sector, which it's not really aimed at initially?
No. So notice on the list of attendees a number of European delegates and viewers. In London, in Greater London, for over 10 years, there's been a rule where you're not allowed to let your apartment, if it's residential use, for less than 90 days, for more than 90 days. So even on Airbnb, there is a tracker for your short let. So in the eyes of the London government, short let is under 90 days. So therefore, I guess a long let would be over 90 days. And obviously that creates a problem in London, because actually a lot of people, as you've mentioned, Paul, 28 days plus, that flexibility of between 28 days and 6 months, there is actually no format for someone to rent for between 28 days and 6 months. And ASTs tends to be 6 months, and it's a formal lease and deposits and everything else. And so if someone is relocating for a project, or there's an insurance problem, or whatever it may be, coming to do a film, there is that void. So where, as you said, George, where this has all come from is places like Devon and Cornwall, where locals are not able to afford homes anymore because everyone's turned their homes or second homes or third homes into Airbnb, short-term rentals, basically for the summer. So through the summer, it's booming. Through the winter, it's deserted. In the summer, there's nowhere for workers to live, so they have to commute. And that's where this is all built up from. It all hit the news when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. In his first week, on the Thursday, he mentioned it, that he wanted to basically stop holiday rentals. Not exact words, but not far off. And so with the ASAP hat on, James and I and the board sort of set on this campaign to try and like understand what the thinking was. And really, it is, as you said, George, it's not targeted at corporate service apartments or, you know, I probably see long stay as over 6 months, but maybe the medium stay of 28 days to 6 months. But we're being brought into the whole thing. So we've been able to speak to all the major parties. So we've had meetings with the Lib Dems. We've had engagement with the Minister of Tourism, the current Minister of Tourism and the previous Minister of Tourism. And also we had a private meeting with Angela Rayner, who was the deputy leader of the Labour Party. And a lot of the stuff that came back was, what is this industry worth to the UK or England? Because obviously Scotland has already done some changes, which has been quite damaging to short-term rentals. And actually there isn't really figures anywhere. So we embarked on doing a study, which we launched 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's been sent to all the major parties now, basically valuing service apartments to the UK economy at around £1.7 billion. Yeah, that's a lot for a country that is not growing and hasn't grown as a country for years in terms of its GDP, and obviously the residual value around that of the film industry and even the green sector, where there's a lot of people who work in the Humber area doing wind farms and all of that sort of stuff, rather would stay in a home than in a hotel for that period of time, 2 or 3 months. It could damage it a lot. So where we're up to, 2 consultations took place at the same time, one around licensing and one around planning. Planning was from a different department to licensing. So DCMS, which is the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, as you can hear, doesn't have tourism in it, but tourism is part of that, did the licensing part. And unbeknownst to them, on exactly the same day, Michael Gove, who's the Department of Levelling Up, launched a planning consultation, which obviously overshadowed the licensing one. And that went all out, and it was all the data had to be received back by middle of August last year. And so far there has been no conclusion. So where the industry, and it's not just service apartments, there's holiday homes, there's lots of different, you know, parts of this sort of flexible accommodation offering, are saying that, you know, licensing, if it's light touch, involves health and safety and insurance and all of that sort of good, safe accommodation stuff, is actually probably a really good thing. And at that point, you will understand the real scale of the industry, and at that point, you should then make a decision around planning and if it's regional or where it really affects local communities, because we also appreciate that it has caused issues around levelling up and homes and everything else. So that is where we are now. As those in the UK will know, there is a different scandal every week about someone, and every time we think we're given a date of something will come out, it seems to be pushed back. And so actually at the moment, we don't really know. We do think from the current government, this is quite a big part of their manifesto in terms of sorting out housing. So our concern is that they do a knee-jerk planning piece before doing the licensing piece, which would then potentially cause a lot of issues. What they did come up with was, so at the moment, if you have C1 use, it's hotel, apart hotel and so forth. C3 is residential. And one of the proposals was to create a new form of planning called C5, which is basically short letting planning, which in theory sounds really good until you see the rules. You don't know if it's good. So those figures that we have pulled together, you can get them off the ASAP website, and Georgie wrote a nice article about it too. Gives really good context for government or people making decisions of, right, okay, if we do this and we lose half, can the UK afford to lose £900 million of an industry that, you know, probably needs some legislation, but doesn't need to be shut down. So that is where we are. So I think it was very unfortunate that the planning thing came at the same time, because I think the licensing debate was actually a really good one and a really healthy one, a bit like star ratings were many years ago. And it was that sort of conversation about like trying to professionalize the sector a bit. And I think it took the wind out the sails of DCMS and the people leading that a bit. And it was very confusing. I don't know if any of you saw the consultation. If you were answering both, it was like very contradictory in terms of what you were saying and how you were saying it. And yeah, so again, yeah, sorry, it was a bit of a long answer, but a lot's happened and a lot hasn't happened, which means that I think there's a lot of people a little nervous about expansion, about signing leases or buying buildings or doing stuff, because if they suddenly do some crazy like 90-day, nothing under 90-day restriction, which again is not necessarily been suggested, you know, Airbnb would have to really change their platform to be over 90-day stays, and I think the whole shape and look of the relocation world and business travel and projects and films and everything would change. So when we met Angela Rayner, she was actually very she really acknowledged the importance of flexible accommodation, of temporary flexible accommodation, which is the not so sexy way of explaining what we all do, and the requirements around industry and business and insurance and council relocation and medical tourism and business and even politicians, dare I say. So yeah, I think now we have figures. We hope that at least we can defend any legislation that is put in place and also promote a better way of doing it.
Thanks, Steve. There's a lot to unpick there. Firstly, it's not the finest example of joined up government that you've ever heard. My hunch is that the current government may not be in position long enough to implement any of this stuff. But just to pick up on the planning piece there, can you tell us what the proposed C5 actually entails, and would we get to the situation where some operators in their current guise would have to comply with potentially C1, C3 and C5 all in the same building? Because we do have current examples of C1 and C3 in the same building.
I mean, I for what we do, it'd be amazing to have flexible planning. I mean, it'd just be incredible. So there is no indication on it at all, apart from, and I filled out the consultation myself, and it was like, what do you think about having a new use around C5, short letting, and then you could put in what you felt. And so I said, you know, if you wanted to restrict it, you know, one night stays may be disruptive to a local community, but maybe 14 nights wouldn't be, like in Dublin, or, you know, but I also explained that, you know, some people will move somewhere for 7 days and extend and extend and extend until 3 or 4 months, you know. So that is where it's got to. It's been very quiet. Those who know British politics, Michael Gove doesn't really feature anymore. He seems to be a bit quiet, which is both concerning and wonderful at the same time. But I think you're right. I think time is ticking for them, but because we don't know when the election will be, which is either July, October, or January, that's the reality of when it's going to be, no one knows. So if it's October or January, there is time for them to push something through. Badly, ill thought through, with no idea of how it's going to be implemented, but would create a shockwave, as I'm sure you would know. So I think even hotels would say to you now around the world, having more flexibility in their planning would be better. Apart hotels would probably say the same, with restrictions around height of buildings and kitchenettes and all sorts of things. So the fact that our planning rules are based off a 100-year-old set of rules and laws, you know, does need to change. It's not something that can be rushed, but it may be rushed. With this study, we've had a lot of interest from other countries around Europe, and a bit like this EU framework, our plan is next somehow is to try and do an EU study to then try and help inform the EU as well about what the whole value of all of this is and how it differs in each country. And actually that some of these housing issues are caused by governments not building enough social housing, as opposed to operators taking over luxury buildings that would otherwise potentially sit empty, and it's creating great revenue and support to local communities. But yeah, there is no fine line, and I think unfortunately, if you look around the world, there is no real brilliant case study of how someone has really transformed planning to feature, you know, basically another version of the gig economy in Airbnb that has brought great value to a lot of destinations and also issues. So yeah, it's a really challenging one, and to be honest, I wouldn't want to be in government on many levels, but I wouldn't want to be deciding on it because someone is going to lose out.
Yeah,
for sure.
I mean, as you say, essentially the lack of building new homes is the root of the problem, and you know, trying to address it via various means such as rent control in the build to rent sector, which they're looking at the moment in, you know, in the residential letting section. It's just a sticking plaster. It's not addressing the real issue. But anyway, we're digressing a bit there. Kevin, with all this legislative uncertainty, legislative threat around Europe, you're operating in several countries and you're looking to expand to more countries. Is this affecting your strategy? Is this making you change the way you look at potential new locations to open apartment buildings?
So far, to be very honest with you guys, actually, it's not concerning us, because for us, it's more, we are a young company, we start to grow, we actually obviously are looking into new markets, there are regulations, and at some point we have to tackle them. The way we tackle them is we just literally look at all the compliance and everything which is around there, and we just insert it into the business case, and in the end it has to reflect on the rent you pay per apartment, obviously, and we really think very easy about that. If it has to make fun for both of the sides, right? For the owner of the building and for us as an operator.
Mm-hmm. And are you a fairly flexible operator in terms of the length of stay that you offer? Do you offer kind of hospitality type short stays?
Yes. So actually we are licensed as commercial operator, which means in Germany you can operate from 1 day until 182 days. After 182 days, the guest just has to check out of his room and check into another room, and then the period rolls again. This is the only limitation we have.
Yeah,
I mean, there's more of a question of, we here in Berlin, for example, they have huge problems with people finding flats and everything. And so far, the government is considering us, like the service apartment sector, more of a problem solver, because we operate in a commercial way. It's licensed. We have all the agreements from the government, which makes our life a bit easier actually than in comparison to other landlords, which are probably just operating classical Airbnb apartment or flats. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. One of the things which occasionally sends a little shiver down the service department and indeed the wider business travel sector is Airbnb makes an announcement that it periodically is going to really focus its efforts on this and try and take a bigger share of the corporate travel market. So they introduced Airbnb for Business. I think that was renamed Airbnb for Work. Paul, where are they at the moment, and have they been making noises recently about trying to get into this sector?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That I think it was 2014 that Airbnb for Business launched. So in reality, that's actually quite early, and then they rebranded it later as Airbnb for Work. I was looking at some statistics actually just the other day, and from 2015 to 2016, and again from 2016 to 2017, they actually saw 3 times growth in bookings for long-term or extended stay business travel. And I think by 2018, apparently 700,000 companies were using it. So it's maybe important to say as well that Airbnb, I think it's fair to say, was one of the early adopters really of flexible work and flexible living, particularly in COVID times, allowing employees to live and work from anywhere. I think for up to 90 days a year in something like 170 countries. Now we're starting to see more of a sort of transition to experiences, and we even last night Airbnb was announcing its summer release, where they announce the latest products that are going to come out for the next quarter or half a year. And actually there was no mention at all there about long-term rentals or anything to do with this, but they had something in there called icons about experiences with famous hosts and all sorts of different things that we've got a story live on short-term rentals now. But Airbnb experiences, there's so many different opportunities out there now for teams and companies if they want to do tours, if they want to do events or team building activities, or we're starting to see more homes becoming available for corporate offsites and meetings, as well as letting employees secure temporary housing if it's employees relocating for work. What I would say is, while they have made inroads into the business travel sector, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily too meaningful inroads. They've maybe kickstarted something, but if you go on the website now, as I did yesterday, it can be sort of tucked away in the back end a little bit, and we're starting to see you see the adverts on TV or on YouTube. It's very much sort of targeting specific demographics, I would say, which don't necessarily fit that business travel mold. It's a lot more lifestyle, a lot more glitzy, a lot more style. So I think it remains to be seen just how sort of successful these inroads have been. And while they are talking about expanding into new verticals, I think there's still a bit of work to be done in this particular segment.
Yeah, I have had a look at some of their marketing, and it's very, like I say, it's very glossy. It's very B2C feel rather than a B2B feel.
Really?
Steve, the corporate travel buyers, who are obviously the gatekeepers for a huge amount of business travel, I think traditionally have been fairly wary of Airbnb and have stayed away from it mainly for duty of care reasons, accountability, and so on. Is there a thawing towards them as they're making efforts to win more business travel? And a supplementary question: do you think business travelers are getting more autonomy to book themselves through channels like this? Are there less gatekeepers to go through to book business travel?
Crikey, there's a lot there.
Only got 15 minutes left.
I know. So if you look at a lot of the larger either hybrid or sole sort of relocation, business travel, corporate, service department bookers, a lot over the last 3 or 4 years have invested in online platforms, their own platforms, and the ability for people to either book online or in a closed group. So it may not be admitted, but I actually think that Airbnb have trailblazed the way that you can actually purchase long stay online. It's happened also in the student apartment world, where you've got large platforms that take 9-month bookings at potentially £500 a week for a studio for international students coming to all different countries around the world. So I think Airbnb has opened up that comfort in people purchasing this sort of accommodation online. And operators like Kevin's probably have a really good have a really good online platform version of what they do because of Airbnb, because of Booking.com. So I think the thawing is there. I think where the argument has always been is that the business travel world curates the platform that they sell to their customers, and that Airbnb don't. And there are some countries that don't require legislation, and therefore you could turn up somewhere and it doesn't have a fire alarm and so forth. So I think the licensing here, in theory, would correct that, because you could only operate, and I think Airbnb have supported that. You can only operate if you have a license, and therefore, you know, you're deemed fit and safe and compliant to operate safely for business travelers and leisure travelers alike. So I think there's probably more of mutual respect. I think we're always seen as a threat, because no matter how big a business travel business is, a well-funded tech business out of Silicon Valley could drop $500 million in advertising and gain market share very, very quickly if they really focused on it. Whether the operator would be happy with that, whether the end big blue chip company would be happy with that, I don't know. In terms of autonomy, I think that there has been sways backwards and forwards. I think there's probably more autonomy on shorter stays than longer stays. Ultimately, the travel buyer, the agent, and the operator would rather not have people moving around if they're supposed to be in for 3 or 4 months. And I think the curation of it, you know, the number of emails that go backwards and forwards for a long stay, you know, like that 3 or 4 month stay, what people want, if they want a different bed size, you know, all of that stuff, it'd be very messy doing it through platforms. And so that personal contact is quite important. So I think there's probably a mix depending on the company. When I ran hotels 20 years ago, we picked up some pretty good corporate budget hotel just after the financial crisis in 2008. And we got some really good corporates direct, actually, because they cut travel buying programs and said, look, you've got this budget. And we were budget hotels. The guys stayed with us for 99 quid. And they say, we'll spend 50 quid in the bar and restaurant. And they preferred that, you know. So I think it will change, but I think it's going to be different cycles in different countries depending on different needs, and also how that business travel world works in the future. If you know, being able to go and bounce around to different countries around the world is part of your role, then the more flexibility, the better, which potentially Airbnb provides if everything is safe and compliant. Because ultimately, if they're there for work, it's the business's responsibility for it to be safe and secure and compliant and everything else.
Yeah. I guess the logical extension of this is 20, 30 years down the line, every country will have some sort of licensing scheme, and then you know, a level playing field. But as we've already discussed, getting that implemented takes a long time. You know, if the UK example is anything to go by. Kevin, your business travelers, your business travel customers, how do they tend to come to you? Is it through an agency? Is it through a corporate travel buyer? Or are you seeing an increasing number of them coming directly to you?
Actually, 60% of our portfolio is coming directly to us, and the other 40% is coming through the OTAs. Obviously, now we also picked up with a sales team, which are only focusing on very strong direct business contacts and corporate contracts. But yeah, most of the guests are actually direct.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Right, we have had some questions coming in. One from James Boyce here. James, I think we might have already answered your question, but we'll just chuck it back there anyway. Paul, earlier you were saying that Airbnb business-related stays are up by 30% year on year, but do we know what proportion of their total business that is? I think you said extended stay,
yeah,
rather than corporate business, but are they detailed enough in reporting that?
Not in terms. I don't have. Sorry, Jazz. I don't have the latest figures exactly today. The number that I quoted was that the number of long-term stays had increased by more than 30% since 2019. So that's talking globally there, and that trips with a duration of 3 months or more had increased by almost 20% from if we're talking about the last earnings report, and that's pretty much what I'm going off there. That the last earnings report was in November, and it was up almost 20% on the equivalent quarter a year ago. I would say that I would probably expect. I think we're expecting a sort of slowdown, a moderation in terms of length of stay in that time, because sort of cross-border travel starting to come into play as well. But I think we are going to see a gradual decrease in the sort of volume of length of stay on Airbnb.
Yeah. So James, I don't think we will have the specifics there. I think they're keeping.
I know the next earnings report for Q1 actually is well worth tuning into. I think it's next whenever the 8th of May is. I think that's next Tuesday, is it? So yeah, we'll definitely be reporting on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Another question from Solo Natali. How does it work with registration compliance for working transferees, short-term working transferees in other countries? I'm not sure who wants to pick that one up. Steve, do you want to have a stab at that?
Well, we don't necessarily have to have registration forms, but obviously with a lot of corporate buyers, we have to do a pre-arrival checklist. And also we have to, for certain corporates, show all of our corporate liability, employer liability, health and safety documents, and so forth. So we don't have a specific thing in the UK or in England where there's a specific registration as such for a corporate traveller. There is for hotels and what's not, where you need to get ID and so forth. So that's slightly different here. Maybe that will be part of the new legislation going forwards. But yeah, we do have to prove all of our, for that corporate role, we have to prove all of our health and safety documents. And we also get accreditation through ISAP to make sure that that ticks another sort of independent body of approval too.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Right. I want to finish by asking you each of in turn a very broad question, and I think you probably all have a slightly different interpretation on this. On balance, is Airbnb a positive or a negative for traditional operators and platforms in the extended stay sector? And I'm going to start with Kevin.
I don't think so personally. I think it's an opportunity for all of us, and I had this discussion a year ago at a conference where the classical hotel operator, they got a bit upset and they said probably the 16,000th time again, oh, we all have to come together in order to fight them. And there was a young lady and she just said, you know, guys, you can use it. No one actually pushes you in order to use it by heart. If you want to use it, it's your benefit. In the end, I say you can use it as a marketing platform. If you don't want to sell rooms, just have your apartments there. They are listed. Make sure they are in a good shape. You have nice pictures. People will click on it, and obviously, what they do next is if they like you, they try to look up your website. It gives you a lot of opportunities, and especially when the commission rate is rather low, like at the moment. I mean, obviously they never mention it in a press release. That's what they told me, but that's how it is. Yeah, just use it and see if it also works for your business, because there are quite other OTAs out there which obviously do not work for us because their target group is way different. But in case of Airbnb, I think it's quite useful, at least for us.
Yeah. I guess one thing that shouldn't be overlooked is how Airbnb over the years has normalized staying in an apartment rather than a hotel room, which you can't really underestimate the benefit of that. Paul, what's your take?
Yeah, I'm really torn between being really opinionated here and giving a more of a journalist answer. So I think I'll take the safer option slightly with with the balance. But if to provide a bit of balance first, I would say that Airbnb, I think, has really, like you say, revolutionized the way that we think about not just accommodation but travel and bookings. I think there's things that Airbnb can learn from the extended stay sector in terms of service, professionalization, flexibility, consistency. But there's also things that the extended sector can learn from Airbnb. If we look at how Airbnb has marketed itself over the years and exposure, and really sort of given awareness to the segment. So I would verge towards saying it's a positive. I think that there is definitely still scope for a big platform that still caters really for extended stay, long term, perhaps digital nomads in a way that maybe Airbnb is not. We're seeing Airbnb is expanding into more products and verticals that it might almost bypass this sector and expand, I don't know, into car rentals or AI or experiences that maybe it would leave a bit of a gap for a new player to come in.
Interesting. Steve, last word to you.
Yeah, I think they have trailblazed the way that everyone has said in terms of normalizing apartment and yurts and other forms of alternative accommodation. I think if they could clean up the quality side, and that's the same for other OTAs, because others don't ask always for full health and safety documents and everything else. I think if you did that, then I think it will help the industry improve standards even more. And I like the idea, as Paul is saying, is that obviously from Airbnb, lots of other tech platforms have actually sprouted out from it, and operators. And so I think it's been broadly good. I think they do. Being the Coca-Cola in the sector always causes problems, and obviously there's other OTAs who do exactly the same but get less of a bad rap. But I think if they could diversify the platform, or others diversify the platform to encourage longer stays, then I think it'd be really good for a lot of different operators and really good for the sector.
Thank you, Steve. Right, just going to show a couple of quick slides before we wrap up. The next Service Department News webinar is a market update from around the world. So my colleague Eloise will be talking to industry professionals from every corner of the globe to find out how the market is performing in their particular neck of the woods. If you'd like to sign up for that, you can see a link in the chat. As you saw in the video at the start, the Service Department Awards 2024 ceremony is coming up soon, the 23rd of May. There's still a few tables left. The shortlist was announced yesterday, so the tickets are going fast. And I really recommend you get there because it's a really good night. It's one of the highlights of the industry calendar. Again, the relevant links are in the chat. If you'd like to work with us at Service Department News or any of our other brands, whether it's on our digital platforms or our in-person events, get in touch with my colleague Rav, whose details are on the screen and also in the chat. And finally, just want to say thank you. Thanks to Urban Rest for sponsoring the webinar series. Thanks to Steve, to Paul, and to Kevin for their great insights today. Thanks to you for watching, for your interaction and your questions. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully see you at another webinar soon. And I hope to see a lot of you at the awards on the 23rd as well. We'll leave the session open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes from the chat. And that's it from us. Thanks very much. Have a great day, everyone.